We spoke to Dan Rice, special advisor to the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, and he told out front that these types of weapons are 5 to 10 times more lethal than Ukraine's current weapons, and they are more effective against Russian personnel and armor. And here's why. We'll show you a graphic here. The first one shows the blast area from just one normal high explosive round. The damage that bomb lands about 160 feet. Now let me show you a cluster bomb, the ones Ukraine is now asking. 88 little bomblets go out. They scatter over an area of more than 320 feet. That is why Ukraine wants them. If they're going to aim at a group of Russian soldiers, they don't just have one hit and it spreads out. They can kill a lot more of them. Will Ripley is out front live in Kyiv tonight to begin our coverage. And Will, what is the latest there tonight?
Well, I've seen the impact of those cluster bombs firsthand. We met a woman who had one go through the wall of her children's bedroom. These are very serious business. Ukrainians also developing drones that are flying deep into Russian territory, drones that have hit strategic air bases as close as 500 miles to the Russian capital, Moscow. You have President Putin threatening nuclear weapons and already using 1980s Soviet-era nuclear weapons on Ukraine. He's just launching them as dummies right now without warheads. But they're landing, they're lobbing themselves into buildings, and the Ukrainians know that these missiles were built in the 1980s to carry nuclear warheads, of which Putin has plenty. Is that a sign? Is that a signal for the people of Ukraine? Is it an attempt to try to exhaust their air defenses? Either way, the Ukrainians certainly know what's at stake here. That's why they're launching more counteroffensives. They're defending Bakhmut, which Russia is trying desperately to take to demonstrate some level of success on the battlefield because they've had a string of humiliating failures. There's also word tonight, Aaron, that there is another potential front in this war. So we've talked about the Donetsk region to the east. We've talked about Kherson to the south. Well, now, up by the Belarusian border, there are troops on the Belarusian side mobilizing. They're calling them military exercises, but hundreds and thousands of troops are expected to be gathering there in the coming days, and the Ukrainians are also there starting to dig trenches, starting to build in reinforcements. This is why they're asking for these cluster bombs and any other weapons possible to prevent yet another potential ground invasion. Could it happen in the coming weeks? Could it happen in the spring when things warm up? Because temperatures are really plunging here, the official start of winter later this month. They don't know all the answers, Aaron, but what they do know is that Putin is likely going to throw everything he has into this war, and they're going to try to do everything they can to stop him.
All right, thank you very much, Will Ripley. And obviously ominous, considering that Belarusian border is where the troops had all poured into that original offensive and attack on Kyiv itself. Well, as I mentioned, the exclusive reporting tonight, Ukrainian officials pushing the Biden administration and members of Congress to provide the Ukrainian military with cluster munition warheads. Now, these are the weapons that I mentioned Russia has been using to devastating effect. They are also weapons that are banned by more than 100 countries. So let's go to Natasha Bertrand in Washington, who broke this story. Natasha, what more are you learning tonight?
Yeah, Aaron, so the Biden administration not officially responding to our reporting here, not providing official comment, but what we have learned is that senior Biden officials have been weighing these requests by the Ukrainians for these cluster munitions and have not rejected those requests outright. So what we've also learned is that the Ukrainians have been asking for these munitions for months. And obviously it's a very controversial request because, as you laid out, these are bombs that explode and launch dozens and dozens of tiny little submunitions that then explode themselves. And part of the risk, just apart from the fact that they can, affect such a large group of people, such a large area of land, is also the fact that many of these submunitions, when they explode on the ground, don't actually explode. And so like landmines, they kind of just lay around until people and potentially civilians encounter them. So this is very controversial. The Biden administration is weighing it, but they say that they're not necessarily considering it seriously at this point, primarily because Congress has actually imposed restrictions on the U.S.'s ability to send these cluster munitions overseas. Now, President Biden can overrule that, but that would require kind of an extraordinary determination that the administration does not seem prepared to make at this point. However, the Ukrainians have been saying this could really be a game changer for them on the battlefield, and the administration weighing it as they do with all of the other Ukrainian requests for weaponry, Aaron.
Okay. All right, Natasha, thank you very much. And obviously a significant step there. Let's go now to the former defense secretary and former CIA director under President Obama, Leon Panetta. So, Director and Secretary, of course, the Ukrainians are saying that this would be a game changer. Do you believe that the U.S. should provide Ukraine with these cluster munitions, even though, of course, they are banned because of what Natasha said, some of this damage that they can cause down the line to civilians in more than 100 countries. Should the U.S. provide them now?
I think it's well that the administration consider this request very seriously. Look, the Russians are not playing by the Marquis of Queensberry rules. They've used cluster bombs. They're sending missiles into schools, into hospitals. They have no regard for human life. The cluster bomb is designed to go after a military operation where you've got military units that are gathered in the battlefield. I think if there are some conditions with regards to the use of those kinds of weapons, I think it is possible that they could have that kind of weapon. They've got to be able to defend themselves against what the Russians are doing. That's absolutely essential if they're going to succeed.
And let me ask you about what the Russians are doing. Putin, of course, now is personally making a nuclear threat and referring directly to ICBMs, right? Which would be, he's talking about the U.S. and Russia, right? He's making that very clear. You know him. You met him when you worked in the Clinton administration, when you worked in the Obama administration. He's now saying not just this threat, he's saying the threat of nuclear war overall is increasing. Those are his words. If he were to use nuclear weapons in any way in Ukraine, and he's also now making it clear he'd do a first strike, how would you want the U.S. to respond?
Well, I think the president has done this and made very clear that if the Russians use nuclear weapons, that there would be catastrophic consequences to the use of that kind of weapon. And I think that's exactly what should happen. If Putin crosses that line and makes use of a nuclear weapon with regards with all of the ramifications of what a nuclear weapon can do, I think the United States and our allies have to be willing to respond with force if necessary, in order to make clear that that would force the United States, Ukraine, and our allies to confront Putin and the Russian invasion directly.
Russia has now blamed Ukraine for several attacks within Russian borders. The White House said today the U.S. respects Ukraine's military decisions, and but that the U.S. has not encouraged or enabled those strikes on Russia. Obviously, there's speculation that Ukraine now has its own internally developed drones that enabled them to do this. That's the speculation. What do you think happened?
I think the Ukrainians are defending themselves. That's what I think has happened here. These are bases where Russian planes are taking off to deploy this barrage of missiles that are going into Ukraine and doing tremendous damage to human life, to their infrastructure, and to their entire country, really. And so, you know, I think the Ukrainians have every right to defend themselves in this situation. It's up to them. But if I were in a situation where they are taking direct hits from the Russians every day, I think the Ukrainians have a responsibility to respond. So I understand their need to be able to defend themselves.
Well, I think it's significant, right? You're not just saying a right to respond, but a responsibility to respond to where those are coming from, which, of course, is deep in the heart of Russian territory itself. Secretary, thank you very much.